Good morning. This is Ron Thomas again. I'm in Maryland this time, and I'm doing a solo monologue for a change instead of the usual dialogue and discussion that I've been doing in my previous videos. This is kind of a demonstration a little bit of some of the ideas that I thought would be interesting to just present directly from out of my own notebooks, my own research. And again, the subject matter is the artistic enterprise as a practitioner might look at it, and the artistic enterprise as part of a larger historical curriculum, so to speak. So this is kind of an additional feature of these YouTubes that I'm trying to put in a series. This one is kind of an extra one. I hadn't planned on this, and I want to thank my nephew, David Tack, for pitching in and helping me to put this together. So this is part, whatever it is, 5 or 6 of a series of video presentations that I'm doing on those subjects. So I hope you enjoy it. Thanks for watching. The first part of this that I'd like to talk about, I can introduce with a quote from a composer from the 20th century named Roberto Gerhardt. And he made a statement that is very much focuses on pretty much the exact subject that I'm dealing with all the time. He spoke about the radical incompleteness of all our efforts, speaking as a composer. And that whole idea of incompleteness, of the fragmentary, in fact my journal is called Fragments, and it lives up to its title because it's radically incomplete and it's radically unfinished, and it has a lot to do with the aesthetic of composition that seems to have evolved over the years as well. So another quote from my actual Fragments journal before we take a look at this notebook is: the library, which is in fact where we are today, is a lot like a used bookstore. It's a place to wander and learn. It's also like a mind. It's kind of a metaphor for the mind of man in a way, because it's like a mind, or like even a person. It's a set of propositions, and as books leave and come in, they are like the propositions in a person also leaving and coming in. A human being entertains millions and millions of propositions in the course of a lifetime. And if we actually had a chance to watch them going in and out, we can see that some things remain and some things go, and some things go and come back. And some philosophers even have talked about this metaphor as a metaphor for human consciousness itself and the definition of a human being even as an individual. So as you can see, I kind of dabble in a lot of these kind of peripheral subjects that have come about as the result of my study of music and composition. And it's led me into a lot of these kind of areas. This is something I haven't done for a while. It's an actual written notebook, and it catches everything that I'm interested in at any one given time. And we're not going to deal with anything in particular. This is just a printout from a notepad that I use in my iPhone. And a lot of my notations now are in the computer, since I've kind of gotten up to speed with the computer age. But previously I had done a lot of, this is just a printout of an article that I was interested in, I kept in there. Here's a little series of notes that eventually will be written into this notebook. Here's the title, doesn't really matter what it is. And there's quite a long series of actual journalistic handwriting. I haven't done this for really a long time. This started about 3 years ago. So this is what happens when a lot of subjects come together. Most of this represents a lot of the interest that I have in music itself, aesthetics and philosophy, theology, and just personal notes of different kinds, notes from studying books and whatnot. And it's filled with, if we can go a little faster through it, since this is just an introduction. Here's an interesting one. It has a little piece of paper just taped in here. So there's a kind of an artistic thing about just putting it together. So I didn't have the patience to write it out, so I just stuck the page in and taped it, almost like a kind of a children's book that a young person might make. Drawings and diagrams. A lot of this is really, I think, very useful, and I probably at some point might transfer it to the computer. Then there are these various things like this, which are little notepads. This is from which I got the Roberto Gerhardt quote. And then there's little things like this, or this, who knows why I did this. I'll have to look at it to remember. When I ripped them out of this little book, my perfectionist graphic tendencies makes me want to scissor it off so that little perforation things aren't on there. So I live with all of this chaos in my life very happily, because in a way I've reconciled myself to the fact that no matter how much I might dream or hope for a kind of a complete picture of everything, I realize now that it's not going to happen. And I'm very, very content with just allowing this thing to just remain in the kind of, as Roberto Gerhardt's quote says, in a state of radical incompleteness. One of the big important names for me in the course of my life and research and in my work is Jacques Barzun. And he hits a lot of really interesting themes. As we know, I might say he's primarily known as almost the inventor of cultural history. He just passed away within the last few years at somewhere in his early 90s. This is a quote from, actually a paraphrase of a quote of his, from an essay that he wrote called The Energy of Art. Our age during the first decade of the 20th century was an effort characterized principally by energy and precision, charged with intellect and obsessed with a passion to embrace and organize vastness and complexity. It embodied the changes in sensitivity brought about by speed in aviation, motoring and cinema, exploiting also the sensuousness of new materials shaped by new industrial modes. Electricity and steel were clean compared with the cheap nastiness of 19th century industrialism. The robust challenge of the pre-war modern era was eclipsed by the despair and decay of post-World War I modernism. This despairing definition of modernism covered everything and anything from Baudelaire on, provided its themes were decay, despair, and disgust with the unchallengeable pointlessness of existence. This angry and despondent post-war modern ego is always portrayed by that mixture of sentiment and covert aggression that is inspired by wounded love. And again, this is a paraphrase from the opening of the essay on the energy of art. And it kind of hits on two kind of fundamental themes that have to do with, if you're thinking about, well, what is the 20th century really all about in terms of its, the artistic products that came out of it. And there are those two aspects of it that really start in what I call the old modern part of the 20th century. There are all these new materials. There is this technological difference, which happens in any age as history progresses. The technologies change, and this becomes interesting to the artists, of course. But then there was this incredible psychological or even spiritual kind of impact that World War I had upon the population. To think about the emptying out of England's supply of, if I could put it that way, of young men under the age of 25. After World War I, when the English looked around, they found that most of their young men were not there. And so the devastating impact of this horrible war that happened, Barzun is suggesting a beautiful way of describing it, which is that modernism became defined by anything that reflected this despair and this despondency and inspired by wounded love, as he says. This was a lot of what I needed to find out about myself as I grew older, because I became very interested in modern music very early in my life, and in the early part of my teen years even. And without any knowledge yet of the historical background for any of this, I kind of wandered into this area of despair and despondency, and without really knowing that that's what it was. I'm an American, so I don't have that same connection to the cultural background that the French or the German or the English has in relation to their art. So I, typically American, I just imported it into my consciousness as a kind of as just a sensory input. Schoenberg and Debussy and even Pierre Boulez and Stockhausen and these other modern figures were just artistically intriguing to me. Of course, as I grew older, I began to fill in the gaps of where all this fit in culturally. Another quote from my journal. An example of the new non-modern direction I took after 1973 a piece called Two Shakespeare Sonnets for Voice and Trombone from 1974. A piece that creates an idiomatic stylistic tension between the era of Berlioz and post-World War I modernism. The Shakespearean texts, which contribute to the tension by adding yet more incongruity, are treated as irony in the manner of a Dadaist poem, and are also set syllabically, that is mechanistically, one could say, imitating Stravinsky's alleged practice. The piece is typical of my new viewpoint, in that all musical actions aim to suggest and represent a plurality of associations: literary, visual, psychological, social, cultural. The influence of Shakespeare, by way of Berlioz, on my music is very significant, and these two songs exploit this, as do all my compositions throughout the 1970s. Pure imagination, to borrow from Borges, is dreaming about dreaming, and then through the actuality of the music's performance, a representative approximation from this pure imaginative realm is hopefully revealed. Also from Borges, art is voluntary dreaming. In this sense, imagination is cousin to metaphysics. In such pieces, I move continuously along a scale of what I call associatives, mediating freely between and among them, like a rapacious collector storming the realm of pure imagination in search of metamusical flora and fauna. Each of my works from then on is an individualized plurality of associations. Does that make me an associative pluralist? Perhaps. After 1973, my music will combine associative elements, particulars, and different densities of pluralities, each piece with an individualized structure, as individualized a structure as possible. It is correct to conclude, therefore, that I am perhaps a self-confessed surrealist, or, borrowing again from Borges, a super-realist, a practitioner of the art and science of misdirection and illusion. We, or those like me, I should say, make art because we yearn to discover forms of our own devising, forms that come to life by our own hands. A man catches fish because he understands the ways and the habits of the fish. A composer catches music because he understands the ways and habits of music. Unlike the fisherman, I can also invent the fish. A musical work will, by its particulars, reveal its structure, and this self-disclosure informs us of the work's distinctive features. This is the only useful kind of musical analysis.